Thank you so much for having me today at Clarity 2022. It's hard for me to express what an honour it is to be asked to speak amongst so many fantastic people who have had such a huge influence on the way that I approach this work. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Amy and I am a consultant based in the UK. I work on content design and design systems, and I live in a tiny town called Hitchin near London. And I've worked on design systems for organisations like gov.uk, for Babylon Health, for BT, which includes BT, EE and PlusNet, and now for Springer Nature. And I want to talk to you today about something that's been on my mind recently, which is that I am absolutely sick to death of design systems dogma. So lately I feel as though I can't really go 5 minutes without seeing a tweet or a blog post or hearing a podcast or something with a sweeping statement about what design systems are, what they're not, and how we have to approach this work. So I hear things like, your Figma library is not a design system, or a design system is a product, not a project, or here are 5 features that every design system needs, a thread. And it feels as though we're becoming more and more rigid and dogmatic about what constitutes a legitimate design system. And it leaves us feeling, it certainly leaves me feeling, as though nothing else counts. And we tend to frame our definition of design systems around the most visible artifacts and processes that comprise our system, rather than the underlying work of creating organisational change.
And this isn't a new issue. Gina actually called this out 2 years ago at Clarity 2020, and she asked us to think about our design systems simply as our design as a system.
She asked us to focus less on deliverables and more on the practice of doing the work. But from where I'm standing, that message still hasn't really taken hold. Because every day I talk to people and organisations who tell me things like, our designers think that their Figma library is the whole design system, but we need to focus on the code base. Or our product teams keep building things from scratch rather than using core components from the design system. Or I just can't get my company to see the value and the point in design tokens. Or the developers in our organisation want to version components individually, but that's not really a system. And while the specific problem that these people and organisations are describing does change from situation to situation, the overriding sentiment is the same. There is a right way to do this work, and we're doing it wrong. And the reason that this gets to me so much is because from where I'm standing, dogmatic thinking is leading us to burnout. I have this mental image sometimes of those of us working in the field of design systems, like salmon swimming upstream, in pursuit of this vision of an ideal design system. The current represents our unique context, our organisation's needs and the barriers and challenges that we face along the way. And in pursuit of that one specific vision, we often find ourselves swimming against the current. So when we focus on the current, and the friction, and when we find ourselves making no progress, we conclude that, well, it must be us, or the context, or the people around us. But maybe the problem is the vision that we have is not the right one for us. Maybe we're chasing the wrong thing. So what can we do about this? What are the practical mindset and behaviour shifts that we need to integrate into this work to move ourselves away from dogmatism and into a place where we can create and cultivate successful, sustainable design systems that work for our context? Well, today I want to share 4 principles with you for doing just that, based on my experience of doing this work. So the first one of those is to define purpose before outputs. And this might sound so obvious that it almost seems like a useless thing to say. And you might be thinking, is she seriously telling a room full of design system experts to understand why they're doing this work? Because we all know, don't we? But I want you to think about this. How much do we really interrogate the purpose of this work? And how often do we consider the goals of design systems as changeable, contextual things? So the promises that we make when we are selling the work of design systems are nearly always the same. We promise consistency. A design system will help you standardise your digital experiences. We promise efficiency. A design system will reduce waste in your organisation's design and development processes. And we promise scale. A design system will help you to scale your design decisions across your digital product landscape. And I think we've got to a point where we just widely accept the vision and the value of those things, so we don't really question them anymore. Instead, we just jump straight into setting up the mechanisms for delivering on those promises. But here's the problem. None of these things are inherently valuable. So efficiency is only valuable if it helps us to move faster towards meaningful outcomes for the people using our products and services. Consistency is only valuable if we standardise things to a good level of quality. So there's nothing good about consistently crap. And scaling things is only valuable if they're actually worth reproducing. So it's really important that we take the time to look at where we are as an organisation and we ask ourselves whether these things are actually going to deliver value for us, given where we are right now. Whether or not consistency is a valuable pursuit might depend on whether we are in a divergent or a convergent phase in the design and implementation of our digital products right now. So the way that we typically approach design systems today tends to put our focus on alignment and standardisation of outputs. But is that actually right for us right now? Do we actually want to converge and standardise, or are we in more of an exploratory, divergent phase? And if it's the latter, then how might that impact how we approach the work? And in terms of efficiency and scale, we need to be clear on how we feel about the quality of our outputs and our experiences that we're delivering today in the absence of a design system created to industrialise them. So is what we're producing inclusive and accessible and performant and robust and reflective of our brand and the way that we want to operate and be perceived in the world? If the answer is no, then we may want to consider a design system that concentrates on elevating quality and introducing standards so that we can actually be proud of the work that we're producing, rather than just unquestioningly creating a design system that's set up to industrialise what we're already doing. We have a tendency to generalise about the purpose of design systems, but we really need to know our specific contextual why so that we can deliver value in our work. And that takes me to principle number 2, which is to design for context over convention. So let's look at that. So as we're increasingly confronted with these kind of rules and these step-by-step guides and checklists for creating design systems, it's so easy to set up ourselves on a path of building what we think a design system should be without considering what our context calls for. And I get that. This work can be really, really complicated and complex and overwhelming. And so there's undeniably something seductive about the promise of a paint-by-numbers approach. And speaking as a design systems consultant, it's also a hell of a lot easier to sell in a vision and convince an organisation to invest in this work when the approach is fixed and the deliverables can be clearly articulated. But trying to create a one-size-fits-all approach to design systems can lead us to creating something that's not really fit for our purposes. The vision that we have becomes this square peg for a round hole, and then we wonder why it doesn't fit. So let me give you an example. When I took on my first consultancy role, the directive from my client was clear. You know that GovUK design system that you worked on over at GDS? Can you do that here? And in particular, the client was interested in the contribution model that we had written about and talked about over at GovUK. And GovUK had what I would consider to be the sort of quintessential contribution model. So someone outside of the design system would decide to contribute something. They'd follow our contribution guidelines and criteria to develop that contribution to an appropriate standard with support from the design system team. The contribution would then be reviewed by a working group of designers and developers and the design system team, and then it would either be published or it would go back to the contributor for refinements and iterations beforehand. Now, it definitely wasn't hiccup-free, this process, but on the whole, it ran pretty smoothly and it followed a pretty conventional approach to contribution. So when the client asked me, can you do that here? I thought, great, yeah, I know how to do that, no problem. But there was a problem. For starters, the GovUK design system team was 11 people at the time and still growing, whereas for my new client, our design system team was just 4 people. The GovUK brand and visual language was well established long before we created a design system to help apply it more easily. Whereas my new client was a fast-growing startup, so its brand was still being developed and worked out. Since GovUK is a web-only platform as well, we've been able to deal with a fairly simple tech stack, whereas my new client had to support web, iOS and Android and all of the complexity that comes with that. The culture, community and conventions underpinning the design and front-end development practice in government were mature and solid, but with my new client, small, agile teams of developers and designers had found their own ways of working, and those ways of working were local and distinct and not consistent in the absence of having an organisation-wide established practice. And unlike anywhere else that I've ever worked before or since, designers in government are taught to prototype in code, which meant really tight collaboration between designers and developers. And with my new client's organisation, designers and developers were pretty siloed with a really strong handover culture. So designers would just build prototypes and throw those over an invisible wall to developers. So this strong, entrenched design practice and principles and culture of simplicity at GDS meant that it had been quite easy for us to come up with a set of contribution criteria that everyone could understand and work to. But for my new client, these fragmented processes and complexity made it much harder to get any kind of convergence on that. And on top of that, a team of 11 people supporting a reasonably mature and comprehensive design system has quite a bit of capacity to support this flow of incoming contributions at an unpredictable cadence. But as a team of 4 people trying to build the foundations of an ambitious and complicated system, we very quickly became overwhelmed. And so we had to shut the door to it. We had to stop and think about how we could support contribution in a way that was manageable for us at that time. So we abandoned the GovUK design system model and its traditional approach of letting contributors bring things to us in this ad hoc way, and we took a more proactive approach. Instead of asking contributors to approach us, we published our roadmap of components that we knew we needed to deliver in an order that made sense for us. We set up a weekly forum for contributors to provide input into the components and patterns that we were working on, with each week concentrating on a different component. And we used the sessions to gather requirements and insights and examples and feedback on our early designs. We then took the outcomes of that session and used that to then guide the development of the component or pattern in question before eventually publishing it. And this approach allowed us to start establishing this culture of collaboration and contribution that we knew that we needed without getting completely derailed by ad hoc submissions. The sessions started to strengthen relationships between designers and developers in our organisation and to cross-pollinate knowledge between those disciplines. So we created a practice that worked much better for us by abandoning convention in favour of doing something that was right for our context. We took that existing practice and process that was happening at our organisation and that formed our organisation's systems for designing its products, and we worked with those systems to create something that fit. And this leads me nicely onto my next principle, which is to recognise the existing systems that you have. So what on earth do I mean by that? Well, when we think about and talk about the work of creating design systems, we tend to foresee it happening as a point in time on a linear journey. So we hire our design system team and we plan our work around version 1 and what that's going to entail. We work on that until it's released, and we go from having no design system to having a design system. And approaching the work with this mindset means that often we dismiss all of those processes and practices and tools and resources that existed before version 1 as not really a design system. But what if we looked at things differently? What if we turned back to Gina's definition of design systems simply as our design practice as a system? What that would mean is that even before the official work has begun, we already had a design system the whole time. Even if designers are just creating prototypes in local sketch libraries and then handing those prototypes over the wall to developers who are working in fragmented front-end code bases, and all of this ends up in really inconsistent implementation of our design across our products. What if we thought of that as our design system? And yes, that design system is probably not going to be very effective. It might not be helping us work efficiently at scale, and our products might not be very consistent, and the quality might not even be that good. But thinking of it as a design system doesn't make any of that less true. What it does do, I think, is help us to avoid one of the most common missteps that I see teams making, and that I certainly have made myself, which is that we inadvertently create two systems, the official one and the unofficial one. And the thing about systems that emerge organically is that they tend to have really strong roots. And when we just lay a new shiny design system on top of those systems, then those roots have a habit of breaking through. It's why teams often cling to their own product-specific components rather than moving to centralized design system ones. It's why people continue to reference local pattern libraries over a central design system website. And it's why designers and developers continue to work in silos despite processes and touchpoints and artifacts that are designed to get them to collaborate. So I think it's really important that we don't dismiss our existing design systems, but instead engage with them. We need to recognise their validity and the job that they've done for us, and we need to bring them on that journey with us as we cultivate a design system that serves our intentions better. And this brings me on to my final principle, which is to focus on changing design systems, not building them. If we can shift our mindset to one that acknowledges that we already had a design system right back in the beginning, even before that official work started, then the task in front of us changes. Instead of working to build a design system, we can think about changing our existing systems to better support our needs. So let me talk you through an example of that from a client that I'm working with right now. Design operations at the organisation are in their infancy. And although there's some excellent design work happening, the approach lacks cohesion at a kind of aggregate level. So this includes the tools that designers are using. There's no consistency there. In some teams, designers are working in Figma. In other teams, it's Sketch. Sometimes designers are spending minimal time prototyping, and they're usually working in things like Miro or using just pen and paper before pairing with developers to realise their design intentions in code. And if we chose to build a design system, then the likelihood is that we decide to build a Figma library that can sync with our code base. So from a maintenance perspective, Figma is probably our best bet. But introducing a Figma library into this context doesn't deal with all the processes and behaviours and mindsets that we would need to change for all the people who are not using Figma today for that to work. So introducing any new tool or process to our design systems without changing mindsets and behaviours is like flicking a switch on in one room and expecting all the lights in the house to come on. So instead, we're thinking about what we need to do to get from where we are today, with no consistency in what tools and references designers are using to inform their work, to a place where our design system uses a single tool and a single source of reference. And step one for us is to provide documentation and hands-on support to the managers of those different tools and different libraries in the different parts of our organisation to bring them more in line with our design system. There'll be more steps on our journey after that, but we'll keep focusing on small incremental changes to get us from where we are to where we need to go. Rather than making a design system that ignores our start point and just starts building something new around our goal, we're focusing on changing our existing systems incrementally and over time to work towards that goal. Because the practice of cultivating design systems is not about flicking switches. It's about turning dials, and it's about changing things. And if we can learn how to effectively change design systems, then we necessarily create design systems that can cope with change. And this is really, really important. The requirements of this work will evolve because technologies change and societies change and our environment change and our practices will change and the world changes in ever more unpredictable ways. But dogmatism will keep us stuck. When we are dogmatic about what counts as a legitimate design system or not, then we're tying our practice to this one specific implementation, which won't always be relevant. And the danger is that if our practice and our outputs become too enmeshed, then it's not just our design systems that will become obsolete, it's our practice too. So if we can shift our mindset from building design systems to changing them, then we ground the skills and experiences of our practice in change. And this is where I want to leave you today. The nuance and the complexity and the variability of the contexts that we're building our design systems in is infinite and ever-changing. But dogmatism in our field is forcing us to try and solve these problems in one way, and we can't let it. We have to take the time to define the specific purpose of our design systems in our context and our organisations before we jump into creating outputs. We have to do what's right for our context instead of bowing to convention. We have to recognise and engage with our existing design systems, the design systems that we already have, the unintentional, organic, messy, emergent systems. And we have to change them incrementally and over time to create strong, sustainable design systems that will see us through the evolution ahead, whatever that might look like. Instead of continuing to swim upstream and stopping only now and then to think about how exhausted we are, I think that we can give ourselves permission to do something different. It's okay for us to swim with the current sometimes, to embrace the realities of our context and what they're calling for. And it's okay to look at that design system's vision that our industry dogmatizes and to decide to go after something else. Something that's better for us and our context today. Thank you so much for having me. I really love speaking at Clarity and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.
Hello, and everyone, can we just give a huge thank you and clap or online emojis for Amy's talk? Okay, so Amy, first of all, those are some gorgeous slides. I think the salmon graphics and also how you've included the timeline of incremental changes were really cool to see. Um, let's talk about dogma. Why do you think people are dogmatic about design systems?
Oh, that's a really good question. And yeah, thank you so much for having me for this live bit, by the way. It's so nice to actually be able to kind of step in real time for a moment. So why do I think people are dogmatic about design systems? Because I think this work is really hard. And as I think I kind of alluded to in my talk, I think a lot of the time we're sort of craving that formulaic approach. We're kind of craving that certainty. I know that's something that I've felt. And I think what we often find as people kind of working on design systems is somebody offers us a formula and we think, oh, that sounds convincing. And so then we start going after that approach and that sort of vision that they've set out for us. And we might start to find that it's not working, and we might keep kind of persisting at trying to make it happen. And then I think when people start to say, well, maybe that's not the right approach, what we tend to do, I think, often is, rather than sort of backing away and saying, no, maybe you're right, maybe it's not the right approach, we kind of double down on what we're doing. And I think that's often what leads to dogmatism. I think it kind of relates to the sunk cost fallacy, you know, if you're familiar with that, this idea that once we've invested a certain amount of time and money and effort in something, we can't backtrack. And for me, I think that's the thing. I think it's this kind of, there's this almost sort of panicky bit about it, I think, where we're kind of trying to stick to what we know, because the idea that maybe there's a different way to do it than what we have been doing, I think, is sometimes too scary to confront. So I don't think dogmatism ever comes from a genuinely sort of bad or condescending place, but I think it's just something that we kind of do out of frustration and panic, and sometimes being a little bit burnt out.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us can relate to that. You know, we've already started and we have to kind of keep going on track. So I think a lot of what you have provided here allows, with those incremental steps, to think through if things are working along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I also very much liked that you named that we may not seek out what's actually working for our team, and that we need to define the purpose before outputs. Your point on setting things up to industrialize what we're doing, I was like nodding in agreement the whole time, even though we were not on video at that point. How I was thinking about the diverging and converging stages that you brought up. How might we diverge and converge on the purpose itself?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Because yeah, I think it's important. I suppose what I'm advocating is kind of exploration around that purpose, to understand what's right for you and your organization. So I guess in that respect, I'd probably treat it the way that I would approach any kind of discovery, where we're, you know, trying to understand the problem space and our opportunities there, and, you know, to explore different ideas, but perhaps do that by conversations with people in our organization, with our leaders, with the people who are going to be using the design system, both the kind of direct users and maybe even the people who are using the products and services that our organization looks after and creates, to really sort of understand what the opportunities are, you know, what is it that we want to go after. And I guess also to allow space for that to change over time. So even when we have converged on a purpose that we think feels right for us, it might be that, you know, in 6 months' time that changes slightly, because perhaps our purpose was just standardization to begin with. And then once we've achieved that, maybe our purpose changes. Maybe we want to make sure that things are more kind of more able to be changed or evolve in the future. We want to make things more scalable, or we just want to take a pause and think about the direction that our design is going in. So I think it's about sort of building in that exploration and that kind of discovery, and allowing that divergence of ideas to come through, not just at the start of creating a design system, but regularly as you go through the process of really kind of establishing and scaling your system.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in the context that you were talking about, these smaller stages and really building from there. It does allow for more of this iterative approach to purpose not being defined on day one, and being redefined throughout the process. I also really love the two examples that you brought up of the more mature design system and one that was newer with a new client. And that's really fascinating to think more about the process and what's really needed there. What could teams look for to help figure out the right context for their design systems work? Um, Maybe there are opportunities to change and review things along the way, but are there any things that you would recommend for teams to look for?
To sort of understand their context, you mean, to kind of think about
Yes.
what would be right for them? Yeah, I mean, I think it's about sort of paying attention, trying to not kind of give into this urge, I suppose, to really kind of use, I guess sometimes, what am I trying to say? I just had COVID and I feel like I can't string sentences together. So sorry, I'm
No
being a bit
worries.
waffly. But basically, I think that sometimes we can lean really hard into this idea of kind of frameworks or kind of criteria we need to be.
All
Oh,
right.
did
I
I
think
cut?
we
Sorry.
lost internet for just a second, but I think we're back.
Okay, I don't know at what point you lost me, but just to kind of pick up where I left off about teams, how they can kind of recognize and understand their context and what's right for it. I think it's just about continuously kind of bringing your attention back to that context. So, really doing the work to understand what is happening around you, not kind of resisting that temptation to read articles and blog posts and try and map what you're doing to that. But things like, user research is a really sort of obvious answer here, but I think it's so important to do regular user research throughout creating your design system, and not just with the people using it, but also with people like your leadership as well, to really understand what their expectations are of the design system, because I think ultimately it has to come from the people around you. And I think that's kind of the key to it, really. It's recognizing. And I also, one thing I wanted to add was, if some of you might have been to Converge conference in London last 2 months ago now. If you didn't, I think you can catch the talks online now. But Lily Dart, who is a design systems consultant also in the UK, gave a really, really interesting talk there about kind of official culture and unofficial culture and how we can spot the difference. And I think that's really important here as well. It's like your company probably has some values and a sort of line on what kind of company it is and how things get done. And there may be a discrepancy between that and the way that things actually get done, and the real sort of culture. And I think recognizing that discrepancy and also the area of overlap can be really helpful too, for sort of understanding how to establish your design system in the right way.
Yeah. I think that's such a great point, and what you're talking about with user research is really um, it's something that I don't think gets talked about enough when we're thinking about design systems, and using that as a point to continuously check in on the process. I think we're seeing a theme here: check in often, review things often, and because we're doing that with incremental steps, that's easier to take on and task. And I love that you talked about design practice as a system. And I think that is where a lot of this really comes into play. So, how does that manifest in terms of teams working on this and sharing this? Is it maybe is the deliverable may not be the right word, but is it a documentation step? Is it a training step? How do you see that design practice coming into play when it's shared with teams?
I mean, this is such a cop-out answer, but I would say, again, it kind of depends on context and what's right for you. I mean, I think that in some cases it can be kind of documentation. It can be about documenting things. Sometimes it can be about creating touch points. So whether that's touch points for your designers to get together and, discuss what they're working on. Something we used to do a lot of GDS with show and tells, where they used to have this kind of expression, which I expect they still use, which is show the thing. So rather than kind of talking about the thing that you're doing, just show it wherever it is, whether it's a kind of creaky prototype or it's a more sort of polished, ready to ship service. Show what it is that you're working on, because that's the best way to help people really understand what you're doing. So it might be creating opportunities like that for designers to get together and share that with each other. If your focus is sort of smoothing out and reducing inefficiencies in the design to dev process, handover process, it might be about creating opportunities for designers and developers to get together. So I think, yes, it might be documentation. And as a kind of content designer, I'm very, very in favor of, relying on documentation. But I also do think sometimes we can think about, forums and touch points and processes as kind of human to human interaction as well. So I think there's lots of different ways that might manifest depending on what you need to do with your design system and the organization that you're working in.
It sounds like what you mentioned about user research in the last question, pairing that with some of this, showing that work early, showing the long division, the sketches, all of that really allows people to form and be a part of the process. I think it also can help with getting them on board. If they've provided feedback, they are seeing that thing continue to be built or evolve. So I think that is that's really great advice.
Mm.
Um, I love that. Okay, so jumping on, I think part of this is also like rethinking how we think about design systems. So for our last question, um, let's we're thinking about the not changing systems and not just building them and working towards those goals. Once changes are in flight, are there ways to where we can stay focused on the goal where dogma may try to creep in?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting the idea that we are sort of prone to dogmatism in this area out on the table with your team, with the people that you're working with, also with your sort of wider peer group who are working this area. Like I rely a lot on industry sort of peers for advice and to kind of sense check this stuff. I think if everybody is aligned on that's the thing that we're kind of prone to doing and vulnerable to, then you can help to kind of keep each other in check and keep yourselves accountable to kind of not falling victim to dogma or not falling into that trap. But I think it's just, yeah, like we talked about user research. I think making sure that you really check in on those goals. So for example, we know at the moment one of our goals is to just grow adoption with the client team that I'm working with right now. And so we've just done a bunch of qualitative research to really understand what adoption looks like in practice today, because there's lots of different ways that people are adopting the design system. And we're using that to create a survey that we're now going to send out kind of periodically every probably 3 months for the first year or so, and then maybe we'll reduce it after that. But that will help us to really keep an eye on, are we getting more people to use the system, given that that's a goal that we have right now? Because I guess the temptation is turn inward. And if we're if we're trying to kind of build the quintessential design system, our temptation will be to turn inward and build these components out and make sure that we've got all the foundations in place and we've got our documentation in really good shape and we've got all our tokens in place. And that's not where we are today. And we're improving that. It's one of our goals to improve that, but it's also one of our goals to build adoption. So we need to make sure that we're growing that. And our way for doing that is kind of creating this sort of regular check-in for that. So I think, yeah, keeping yourself accountable, keeping the people around you accountable and asking them to do the same for you, and creating some kind of check-in plan to make sure that you're keeping an eye on your goals and that you're working towards them.
That all sounds really great, and I think it's getting back to the core of systems and how systems work, and a lot of that is communication and I think transparency of what we're working on.
Mhm.
Amy, thank you so much. That was amazing. Where is the best place for folks to reach you online?
Probably still Twitter for now. I've just started a Mastodon account, so you can find me on there too. But yeah, I'm Amy_Hute at Twitter, and it's the same on Mastodon. So yeah, look for me there. That's probably the best way to reach me. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been brilliant.
Thank you so much. Once again, everyone, please give Amy a round of applause.
Thank you.